So let's get started just by looking at what is prompt engineering. Basically, we want to design effective instructions, aka prompts, for the most useful, accurate, and relevant output from large language models, right? Which is the goal. And to demonstrate this, I actually have a video that I think is kind of funny that we should all watch, kind of about good instructions here. I'm going to skip kind of into it and you guys will get the gist of it.
Step 1, on top of each other.
Sorry, I had to make it extremely specific.
Oh, good, I'm starving. Take 2 pieces of white bread out of the bag. Take the lid off the jar of peanut butter. Get a butter knife and stick it inside of the peanut butter jar. With the knife, scoop a bit of peanut butter out of
that means like a lot.
A bit means a lot?
In my world.
There we go.
You're doing better than before, though.
Open the jelly jar. Squeeze it onto the other piece of bread.
No.
Done.
All right, so that's kind of a funny example, right, of how really good instruction is really important, especially when it comes to teaching any sort of machine to do anything, right? I used to teach at Junior Learning where I'd have to teach little kids how to code. And so you have to teach kids that have to be specific, but you also have to be specific yourself. So it becomes kind of like this loop of, okay, we got to make sure that we really know what we're talking about and that our instructions are super clear and that we have every technique available to make sure we're as effective as possible. And now, why does it matter? The quality of a prompt will directly impact the usefulness of the output. Good prompts can save time, improve clarity, and reduce any rework. And using some of the techniques we mentioned can also help increase specificity and reduce hallucinations, aka errors, right? So anything that might happen. All right, research also shows its importance. I have 2 little images here. So this is a recent paper that showed all the different techniques for prompt engineering that have been out so far and that have like research backed up. Obviously, we're not going to go through all, I believe it's 41 of these, but that just goes to show the depth in which people have looked into prompting because it's so important. I have the paper here if you guys want to look at it later. And then also we can see that just employing the foundational methods and more advanced methodologies that we'll talk about today, like chain of thought and self-consistency, can increase the capabilities of LLM significantly. All right. So let's start off with just the basics, what we should do every single time that we're doing prompting. So we always want to be concise, logical, and explicit, right? So that just means our prompts are brief, clear, structured, coherent. We have clear output specifications, right? So for example, if we're trying to grade something like I mentioned earlier, we want to mention, okay, make sure you're following the rubric and have the output go through each line of the rubric and explain each point, right? And we can also improve this by using roles, specific tasks, requirements, and goals. So an example of using a role is, let's say that we're planning a vacation, right? We're asking generative AI to plan a vacation. We can say, okay, act as a travel advisor, or you can say something like act as an educator, and you can specify different levels too, right? So let's say you're grading like high school papers, act as a high school educator in this department or something like that, right? So we want to use roles to kind of get our prompts ready, right? That'll make it more specific towards the task that we're doing. But sometimes I'd like to mention that we also don't want to be specific, right? So let's say we're brainstorming, maybe adding a role will kind of make us too focused and we want to see more outputs than that. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Let's see here. So one of the things I want to talk about is the different types of prompts. We're going to go over 2 of them right now. A 0-shot prompt basically means directly prompting for a response without any examples or demonstrations, right? Let's say you input like a passage and you just say, summarize this passage. That's an example of a 0-shot prompt, right? Or let's say you have like a English sentence and you say, translate this to Spanish. That's a 0-shot prompt, right? You're not giving it any data beforehand, just simply asking it to do one thing. Now, there's also a few-shot prompt. This is giving context as a guide before asking any prompts. And what this can do is this can help increase task specificity and performance consistency, but again, at the cost of generalization and flexibility, right? So this is standard for any complex tasks like programming and educational content creation that I found during this research. So a lot of them use few shots. So basically giving it context. So example for programming, giving it some of your code and saying, here's the output structure I'd like, here's how I code, please follow this, or giving an example of what you want it to do in different ways. And then when you do that, it'll actually get better prompts for that specific task. Again, I want to mention that sometimes zero shot is the best way to go. For example, in sentiment analysis, we actually just want to do zero shot, right? Or else it can get too specific and we can actually start to sway the answers toward one way or another. All right. Now that we've talked kind of about the basics of prompting, we got few shot, zero shot in our memory. Those are two things we definitely want to remember as we start to play around with different prompting techniques. Okay, so let's look at some of the main advanced strategies here. So the first one I want to talk about is chain of thought prompting. A lot of these tools we go through are kind of intuitive, but it's good to actually labelize them and formalize them so that way we know exactly what tools we're using and not just kind of smushing them together. So when we're doing chain of thought, we're asking the model to reason step by step, right? And that helps break down complex tasks. I'm sure we've all done this before, right? Where we ask ChatGPT, okay, let's think this through step by step. The formalized version of that is chain of thought prompting, which has been shown to produce better results than just asking for an answer. And then we have tree of thought prompting. So this is guiding the model to explore different options or ideas before deciding on a solution. So an example of this is, right, list 3 approaches, then explain which one is best. What we're doing is we're asking it to compute like in parallel, right? So instead of just giving us one answer, we'll get 3. And this can be shown to provide better results because the LLM goes through each one. And through each reasoning, it actually gets a little bit better. And so we're hoping that we can get better approaches with this, and we can pick the best one too, which is always nice. And for the next slide, we're going to talk about iterative prompting. Again, this is kind of something that's intuitive, and I'm sure we've all done this, right? Where we refine the output by asking the model to revise or expand based on new instruction, right? So let's say it comes out with something and it's a little too dense, a little too long. We just ask it to rewrite this to be more concise. In terms, we call this iterative prompting. And then the next one is the self-consistency method. And this is having the model generate multiple solutions independently. That's the key word there, independently. That's what makes this different from tree of thought, and pick the most consistent or relevant answers, right? So for example, let's say you go into ChatGPT and you do one prompt asking for the answer to a math problem. You look at that and then you do another prompt independently asking the same question. And you can do this around, a couple times and then kind of picking the best answer out of it. But again, this is independently. That's what makes it different from tree of thought. And then what you can do is you can even take the outputs from each independent one, put it into another prompt, and ask it to pick the best one, just adding more consistency on top. So these are the 4 main strategies that we're going to kind of look at and use for the activity, along with few shot, zero shot, and then those basic principles in the beginning of being logical, clear, concise. By combining all of those, we can get a really good output. All right, and I want to talk a little bit about some common errors that I came across while looking at this. One thing is that vague prompts that are unfocused, right? So you don't want to ask too much of the LLM or else it'll start to reach or jump. I'm sure we've all seen this where we ask it to do something and then it's not super clear, so it starts doing another task, and then you're like, okay, whoa, we're way off track, right? We want to make sure that we're super focused on what we want. Saying what not to do instead of what to do. This has actually been shown to kind of produce more errors and hallucinations is when we say what not to do, right? So it's saying, let's say the output's too long. We say, don't do this. We want to say, do this instead. So make it more concise and clear instead of saying, please do not make it super long and, something like that. It'll actually kind of confuse itself a bit sometimes, adding some more hallucinations. So make sure to say what to do. Overly long prompts too, kind of along the same line of unfocused, will be just less effective than a concise, clear prompt. And under specifying the output format, this one's more for time. It'll save you time from having to redo it, revise it a bunch. If you give it a very clear output format, for example, maybe you say summarize in 3 bullet points, is a lot more clear than summarize just in general, right? So we want to kind of specify the output format, the length, these things to make it more practical. And then not reviewing properly. AI can always hallucinate even with the best strategies. So even if we use self-consistency, even if we use tree of thought, even if we go through it hundreds of times, it can still hallucinate. So we want to make sure that we're always checking our output and always double checking to make sure that it's right and consistent. That's just something super important. Okay. I have a quick little example. So let's say you want AI to help you find something fun to do during the weekend. And let's say you just prompt in, what should I do this weekend? The output will be a general list of things, right, to do without a lot of reasoning, maybe like one sentence, and you'll get a bunch of different answers, right? This is good if we want to be more exploratory. So if we want to see like, okay, let's get a big like burst shot of what we can do this weekend. But it doesn't give you a lot of in-depth reasoning into why you should pick one or the other. Now, if we did tree of thought, we could say, list 3 different activities I could do this weekend. For each, explain why it would be enjoyable, then pick the best one and explain why you chose it, right? So this is a super concise prompt. We're asking for 3 things in parallel, right? So we're not doing 3 different prompts. We're doing it all in one prompt. And you'll get a more specified list of 3 things with better explanations and reasoning, less explorative, but more in depth, right? So this is something that we kind of want to think about when we start to use chain of thought, tree of thought, is that we're kind of, and few shot as compared to zero shot, right? So the more context we're adding, the more stuff that we add on top, the less specific we're getting. Sorry, the more specific we're getting, but at the cost of generalization and exploration, right? So sometimes if we want to brainstorm, it might not be good to actually get super concise and super specific. And to explore this, quick summary here of just everything. I don't know if you guys want to take a screenshot of this, but it might be useful. It's just a little blurb of everything here as we go through the activity. Just talking about zero shot, few shot. I've got the chain of thought acronym there. Tree of thought, iterative prompting, and self-consistency as we go through the activity right now. And then this is the fun part. Let's talk about how it went. Did anyone notice anything crazy? I have a couple of different questions and ideas here. What did people notice when they were using these different techniques, or were you even able to use the different techniques? Were some of them confusing? Were some of them more straightforward?
I think we were at a basic level. We were just trying to understand what to do.
Yeah, right. One thing I saw online too is that it seems simple at first, right? We have all these different techniques and they sound simple in plain language, but then you realize when you're actually trying to implement them, like, oh, these are a little bit more in depth than I thought they were. And I could see how this could progress really quickly, which is why this skill is just something, it's a skill, right? So it's something that we all work on and we can practice. I know, for example, 2 of the things I saw was one, the tree of thought was a little bit confusing because what happens there is we're asking in a single prompt, right, to do 3 different things in parallel and then asking it to kind of explain the best one, right? So we're asking it, say, hey, come up with 3 different ways to derive a popularity score and explain which one you think is the best, right? So that's an example of how we'd use the tree of thought. And then I was in another group and we were talking about few shot. And the idea of few shot is that you give it 2 examples of your own, right? So we were looking at like 3 movies or 2 movies. And we said, let's say it was Pirates of the Caribbean, right? You say, Pirates of the Caribbean, this is my analysis. And then you do another example. This is my analysis. So you have 2 examples. And then you ask it to follow that same idea for a 3rd analysis. But again, you don't write that one. The prompt generates it. And it'll be very similar to yours, very specific. And it's usually really accurate too. Did anyone else notice anything? Was anything else confusing, or was there any crazy things you came up with or anything that happened?
I think for Ryan and I, we started with the 0 prompt. I'm going to say it wrong, but the 0 one. And we didn't give it enough information. We were like too broad. We just said, interpret this data. So after we prompted again to explain the 0 prompt and the other types of strategies, then it gave us examples on how to do it for each. So it made me realize that even though it's the 0 and you don't give it a ton, you still have to give it something.
Yeah, that's super important. Yeah, 0 shot doesn't mean don't give it examples or don't give it, context. It just means that we're not giving it a specified output, specified, super specific examples. We're still going to ask it to do a specific task, right? It doesn't have to be super broad. But yeah, that one can be a little bit confusing too. I also noticed that their group did something cool where they asked it to use each of the strategies to come up with different example questions that they could use, which was a really good idea. I like that.
Yeah, we use it more like a learning tool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Any other groups find anything out?
I think we noticed the differences because we use 2 different AI generators. Matthew used Gemini and then I used ChatGPT, and the outcome of it was very different, but we used kind of similar prompts, and mine looked a little more 3D, and but it couldn't be interactive as opposed to Gemini. So that was just interesting as we use. I think we both did zero prompting as well.
Nice. Yeah, that's really cool. It's interesting to see the differences just across platforms is quite extreme, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the one where you ask it like, do this and then justify your answer. Like, I've never really thought about asking AI to tell me to justify itself, and that was kind of interesting because we asked it to give us 3 different ways to calculate the popularity score, and then tell us which one it thought was the best. So that was kind of cool.
Yeah, right. And it lists out the reasoning pretty in clear logic, right? It makes sense. You can follow it and you can verify it as well, which is important.
Yeah, that was interesting. Yeah.
Really cool.
I also like the idea of asking it to come up with its own solutions to the problem, because in that case, it created a really robust one that I wouldn't have thought of on my own. Like the other ones, I thought, oh yeah, you could do that, multiply this by this to get a score, but it came up with one that was really robust that looked at not only the net earnings and the audience score and the Oscars one. But it the way it grabbed all that data and categorized it to come up with a score is pretty interesting.
And then justified itself to us, and then told us like, but here's why I think what I did for you here was best, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it gave you the flexibility to adjust it too, like to say, weight this more heavily than this, and then it would affect that. So it was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. Did it ask you the follow-up questions like, oh, would you, like, you can even, sometimes it'll ask like, would you prefer to prioritize earnings over, maybe Oscars? And you can actually like fine tune it yourself, which is really cool. And then that would be iterative prompting, right? We're working through it together, kind of coming up with our perfect solution there.
Yeah, it didn't ask me specifically, but it told me we could do that. So
Nice.
Then I could have, at that point, made this one. So, yeah.
That's super cool. Anyone else notice anything? Or anyone have any ideas how they can use this type of prompting for different projects that maybe you guys all work on?
I was wondering, I mean, these prompting styles are very different. Is there a chance that the prompting style aligns with somebody's learning style, where the way that they think logically or the way that they process information would align better with one of these for doing data analysis?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So you're saying like maybe someone does better with like the reasoning step by step, or someone does better seeing like 3 different options and picking the.
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't know that. There might be a paper on that researching it, but yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe that's something you guys could try too, something fun to test out.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. Let's see. Anyone else have any ideas for how prompting could maybe help us out?
We're going to be writing a prompt for an instructor to grade. So we want to use it to grade. In this case, I think it's an essay is what we're doing. And then we have a rubric, so we want it to grade to the rubric, and we want it to give specific feedback to the student. So I was curious, what do you think would be the best one of these to kind of play with first?
So I think when it comes to grading, because it's a more complex task, we're definitely going to want to do few shot, right? So if you have specific examples of how you'd want it to grade, one thing I didn't mention too is that you don't have to use one thing or the other as like they're not separate things. You can use them in conjunction. So like, let's say you use a 0-shot prompt to figure out how you'd want things to be graded. And then once you have an example of that, you can use that output as your examples that you use for few shot. So let's say you come up with a bunch of different ideas for how to grade papers. You pick the best one that they came up with, you maybe change it up a bit each time, and then you use that as your examples for few shot, and it'll come out with a super specific version just like that example you had each time. So that's kind of what I would think to maybe play around with. Using self-consistency would be important too. So if we grade a paper a bunch of times, you want to make sure that it's not like wildly different given your prompt. So let's say you have that few shot prompt, it outputs a grade. Do it again in a separate one and see how similar they are. And then that way we can use self-consistency to make sure that they're actually similar, right? That it's not just kind of coming up with random scores. Like it's 25 out of 30 on this one, but then on this one, it's 30 out of 30. And then on this one, it's 10 out of 30. You know what I mean? We want to make sure that it's consistent as well.
Yeah. It sounds like it'd be easy to just like let it go and just assume it's doing it right. But it sounds like there's definitely a need for some real analysis from a human to make sure that it's actually doing the right thing before you just let it loose.
Yeah, exactly. We want to make sure that this thing is fine-tuned, ready to go. The prompt is exactly where we want it before we start just letting it, grade papers. And that's part of this practicing of prompting and making sure. That's why people get paid to just make prompts. You know what I mean? Is because it can get really specific and it can get really tough to find the right one.
It could also be interesting to give two different types of feedback for each essay, like summative and formative feedback, because for summative feedback, you can just say, give me 4 sentences that tell me how this paper, how well this paper did in relation to the rubric, because that goes back to sort of what Ryan was saying. Some students don't really care. They just want to know, like, what's my grade and why is this my grade? But they don't necessarily care about how to make a paper better. Mm-hmm. So it just depends upon the type of assignment. Like they don't necessarily want that detailed of feedback. So some students really want that detailed feedback, and other students are like, oh, I got a B, tell me why I got my B, and then moving on. So it would be interesting to give formative and summative feedback.
Yeah. Those are all things that are possible too. Also, I forgot to mention, did anyone use any roles? Did anyone ask it to say like act as a data scientist or something like that too? You could even ask it for specific roles, and you'll get better answers that way too. Is from what I found. If you ask it to act as a certain role, that one's something to maybe play around with on your free time. Maybe look at something else, especially when it comes to more creative things too, because then you can kind of get like a certain tone or a certain style. Maybe act as a creative writer from this century. You could even do like different time periods too. It's really cool. Other than that, though, if no one has any questions, I think one thing too is maybe just kind of looking at the summary page, maybe trying a bunch of different things out. I'll release these slides too, so if you guys want to go through it. I have some references at the end too, if you want to read any of the papers that this was based on, kind of get more in depth. Some of it, the testing is really rigorous for these types of prompting techniques, so it's really interesting to look at how they did it and the different metrics they use. Other than that, if there's any last questions on maybe any of the techniques, if not, I think we're good. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
So these sound like the established prompting techniques.
Yeah.
Are there new prompting techniques like all the time, or is it like a pretty established area?
There are new prompting techniques. Let me go back to this one.
That was the list there, right?
Yeah. So I would say about half of these, when I was looking at them, were made in just the past year, just coming out.
Oh,
they're coming out like crazy. This chart was updated as of last fall. So fall 2024. So they just keep coming out. Things like a chain of thought were like 2023, I think 2022. So these are relatively recent developments in terms of like actually verifying that they work and giving them a specific name.
Cool.
I don't know if I can. Oh yeah, perfect. Let's zoom in a tiny bit. Oh, it's a little bit hard, but you can see that each prompt too has its own like subcategory as well.
Okay.
Oh, here we go. So yeah, we can see like fine tuning. We have ape, knowledge-based reasoning and generation. We can see like that each of these kind of have their own. So like code generation has its own specific prompting techniques, right? Optimization has its own. We're using a lot of these reasoning and logic ones here. So you can see there's like thread of thought, graph of thought, tree of thought that we were using, chain of symbol, chain of thought. There's like a ton of different ones that would be maybe useful to dive into. And you can see the time dates here, 2024, 2023. Some of these are coming out as we go. I'm sure you guys have heard of maybe RAG before too. This is a big one here for reducing hallucinations. So yeah, it's worth maybe checking out a couple of new ones too and seeing how they end up. But the ones we went over today are pretty well-known like baselines for what we definitely want to use with good evidence.